what if I told you that one of the most powerful ways to truly understand the Christian gospel, to just really feel the absolute world-shattering weight of what the Apostle Paul was writing about in the New Testament, is to study the victory speeches of ancient Greek chariot racers?
I mean, it sounds like a massive paradox, doesn't it? To
Raw.
find the texture of the New Testament in the lyrics of a completely polytheistic culture from 5 centuries earlier.
It really does. I mean, usually when we want to deepen our faith, we open the scriptures or maybe read some theology or look at the early church fathers. We don't usually look at a guy who wrote glorified sports recaps for Greek aristocrats 2.5 millennia ago.
Yeah.
But that is exactly what we're doing today.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are taking a deep dive into a comprehensive scholarly framework simply titled Pindar Analysis, and we're pairing it with Ernest Mayer's classic English translation and his introduction to the extant Odes of Pindar.
And we are doing this with a very specific and honestly profoundly spiritual mission today, right? We want to know how examining the works of Pindar, a Greek poet from the 5th century BC, can actually deepen your Christian faith, inspire greater love for Christ, and help you live more fully for him in your daily life. Because, as our sources argue, Pindar isn't just an ancient sports journalist. He is, well, he's arguably the ultimate diagnostician of the human condition apart from divine grace.
He really is. Pindar brilliantly and with just unsurpassed linguistic beauty articulates the desperate human longing for transcendence.
Yeah.
For permanence, for glory. And in doing so, he constructs for us the exact towering world system that the gospel was later designed to completely dismantle.
So to understand the cure, we have to deeply understand the disease. And Pindar gives us like the most high-definition scan of that disease. So let's start by setting the stage for you, the listener. If you're picturing the democratic Athens of Socrates, guys in togas calmly debating philosophy in the town square, wipe that from your mind.
Yeah.
That is not Pindar's world.
Not at all. Pindar's context is absolutely crucial to understanding his worldview. He was born around 518 BC. The sources show a slight variance, but late 6th century BC in a village near Thebes, and he died around 438 BC.
Okay.
So his life spans the Persian Wars, the rise of Athenian democracy, and this golden age of Greek cultural confidence. But Pindar was not an Athenian. He was a Boeotian, a citizen of Thebes.
And Thebes was a totally different beast from Athens. I mean, it wasn't a democracy.
Right from it. He navigated an older, deeply aristocratic world. He traveled among the elite families and the immensely powerful tyrants of mainland Greece, Sicily, and the various Greek colonies.
Wow.
We are talking about men like Hero I of Syracuse or Theron of Acragas. These were men who ruled wealthy, semi-independent Western Greek cities with absolute power, massive treasuries, and just sweeping cultural ambition.
There's a piece of historical context in the sources that I found absolutely fascinating because it reveals so much about Pindar's character. He wrote during and immediately after the Persian Wars that massive clash between 490 and 479 BC. And Athens is historically remembered as, the bulwark of Hellas, the city that fought off the Persian invaders at Marathon and Salamis. But Pindar's own city, Thebes, actually allied with the Persians.
Yeah.
They sided with the invaders.
Which was a point of immense enduring shame. Thebes, driven by an oligarchical cabal within its walls and frankly the vulnerability of its geographic location, took the side of the barbarian. Ernest Mayers points out in his introduction that this must have caused Pindar, a man with a deeply noble soul, a bitter pang.
Right.
In fact, Pindar actually wrote a piece praising Athens for laying the foundation of freedom at the Battle of Artemisium.
And his own city punished him for it.
Right.
I read that they were furious.
They did. The legend goes that the Thebans fined him heavily for praising their great rival. But the generous Athenians stepped in, paid the fine on his behalf, made him their proxenos, which is a sort of honorary consul, and even erected a statue of him at the public cost.
I love that detail because it shows he wasn't just a blind loyalist. He had an independent moral compass.
Right.
He refused to just live at the courts of these tyrants like other poets did, stating he chose to live his own life and not be the property of another. But let's shift gears to what he actually wrote. The Epinician Odes, or Victory Odes, for the winners of the Panhellenic festivals. And if you're listening to this and picturing the modern Olympics, corporate sponsorships, national medal counts, athletes talking about their training regimens, you have to radically adjust your mental model.
You really do. We're talking about the 4 great festivals: Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, and the Isthmus of Corinth. What's vital to grasp is that these festivals were fundamentally religious celebrations first and deeply political theater second. Olympia was sacred to Zeus. Delphi or Pytho to Apollo, the Isthmian Games to Poseidon, and Nemea to Zeus and Hera.
Right, so let's unpack why they believed this. How does an ancient society arrive at the conclusion that a chariot race or a wrestling match has anything to do with religion? Because today, we separate athletics and theology completely.
Right. It comes down to their theology of the human body and the natural order. In the ancient Greek polytheistic mind, extraordinary physical beauty, immense strength, and the raw power to win a violent contest were not merely the results of good genetics and hard training.
Right, like we think of it today.
Exactly. They were viewed as literal manifestations of divine grace. The gods were beautiful, strong, and immortal. Therefore, if a mortal displayed overwhelming strength or speed, it meant a god's favor was resting upon them, almost like a physical aura. Athletic victory was understood as the literal interception of divine favor, inherited excellence, what they call RR8, and momentary human glory.
So if you win the chariot race, it basically proves the gods like you better than the guy whose chariot crashed into the wall.
Precisely. And that's why these absolute rulers, like Hiero of Syracuse, spent fortunes competing. They used Pindar's Odes as instruments of political legitimacy. If Hiero wins at Olympia, he brings Pindar back to Syracuse to sing an ode that advertises his victory as ironclad proof that Zeus approves of his regime.
And yet the actual prizes they won were almost comically simple, like a wreath of wild olive at Olympia, Baileys at Delphi, wild parsley at Nemea. You don't spend a fortune on horses and risk your life in a chariot for a handful of parsley unless that parsley signifies that you have been touched by the divine.
It was entirely symbolic. Now, into this highly charged, religiously potent atmosphere steps Pindar. He composed 4 books of these Epinician odes, totaling 45 complete poems that have survived. But as the scholarly analysis points out, he didn't just recount the race. In fact, the actual wrestling match or the chariot race is almost entirely absent from the poems.
I have to admit, I laughed out loud when I read that in the sources. I mean, imagine you are Hiero of Syracuse. You hire the greatest, most expensive poet in the Mediterranean world to write about your epic, nail-biting victory. And he barely mentions the horses.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like winning the Super Bowl, and instead of a post-game interview where the quarterback talks about reading the defense and executing the playbook, a poet laureate steps up to the microphone, ignores the game entirely, and spends 20 minutes tracing the quarterback's family bloodline back to Hercules to prove that heaven itself favors his hometown.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and it perfectly captures the jarring nature of these odes to a modern mind. Pindar wasn't a sports commentator, he was a theological interpreter. The Epinician ode was a precise, highly calibrated literary instrument. He had to triangulate 3 things simultaneously.
Okay, what were they?
The present victory, the victor's noble family or city, and a mythological narrative drawn from the heroic past.
And all of this revolves around that concept you mentioned earlier, aristocratic, or excellence.
Yeah.
But let me push back on this, because this is where the Greek worldview deeply clashes with our modern sensibilities.
Yeah.
In Pindar's mind, excellence isn't just something you practice and achieve, right? It's inherited.
Yes.
So put yourself in the shoes of an ancient Greek commoner.
Yeah.
What about the kid from the wrong side of the tracks? The one who isn't rich, who has no famous ancestors, but who trains relentlessly in a dusty gym every single day. Doesn't Pindar give him any credit for hard work?
The short answer? No.
Wow.
And that is a terrifying realization. Pindar's world was deeply, unapologetically exclusionary. Victory is a gift from the gods, but the gods usually only give that gift to those already born into the elite. You needed the hereditary connection to heroic or divine ancestors.
Rigged.
Essentially, yes. The concept of the daemon, the personal divine spirit that guides a household's fate, permeated his theology. So true arente is a combination of noble blood, physical prowess, and the explicit favor of the gods. If you don't have the bloodline, you simply cannot possess the arete.
So it's a completely closed loop. The rich and powerful win because the gods favor them, and the evidence that the gods favor them is the fact that they are rich, powerful, and victorious. There is no upward mobility in this theology.
None. The system reinforces itself perfectly. And Pindar's odes were performed with massive choral singing, complex dancing, and musical accompaniment. It was a completely immersive cultural event designed specifically to reinforce the status quo of that aristocratic world.
Okay, so that is the overarching societal architecture. But let's zoom in, because the sources go deep into the actual architecture of the praise itself, the linguistics, the literary artistry. Pindar isn't just writing ABAB rhyme schemes. The structure of these odes is incredibly complex. The text talks about a triadic structure. For the listener trying to visualize this, what does that actually look and sound like?
Think of it almost like a highly choreographed sacred ballet. The triadic structure consists of three distinct parts: the strophe, the antistrophe, and the epode. During the performance, the chorus would physically move across the performance space in one direction while singing the strophe. Then they would turn and move in the exact opposite direction, mirroring their steps during the antisystole.
So they're dancing out the poetry.
Exactly. Finally, they would come to a complete standstill in the center to sing the apode. And Pindar repeats this three-part triad throughout the entire ode.
So you aren't just hearing the poem, you are watching a physical manifestation of symmetry.
Yes, and the scholarly analysis argues it's even deeper than aesthetics. This triadic structure creates a formal bodily experience of symmetry and return that actually mirrors Pindar's theology. It physically demonstrates his belief that excellence is inherited from the past, proven in the present moment, and must be continually renewed and stabilized. The very shape of the performance preaches the theology of the aristocratic bloodline.
The medium is literally the message. And the sources also talk about how jarring his storytelling can be. Ancient critics apparently complained about his abruptness. Horace, the famous Roman poet, compared Pindar's style to a rushing river swollen by rain, breaking over its banks. The scholarly analysis uses this great term, vertical narrative.
Right. Think about how we normally consume stories today, like a movie or a novel. It moves horizontally along a timeline. First this happened, then the next day this happened, then the climax, then the resolution. Pindar actively rejects that horizontal timeline. He moves vertically.
What does a vertical narrative feel like to read or hear?
It feels like an elevator, shooting up and dropping down. He starts on the ground in the present moment of the victory. Suddenly, with almost no transition, he shoots upward to a mythological peak, a sweeping story about Zeus or Hercules. He lingers there and then drops right back down to the present occasion, or delivers a sharp theological maxim.
Sounds a bit disorienting.
It demands an audience that already has the entire mythological encyclopedia memorized, so they can follow his associative, leaping logic.
We are getting into some deep linguistic waters here, but if you're listening, stay with us, because this is where the payoff is incredible. The analytical framework applies a linguistic theory called Hallidaian Systemic Functional Linguistics, or SFL, to Pindar's Greek. Now, I know Systemic Functional Linguistics sounds like the kind of college class you drop after the first week, but I promise the insight here is mind-blowing. Can you build explain, like I'm 5-foot analogy for what SFL actually does?
I can certainly try. Think of standard grammar as just the rules of the road, where to put a comma, how to conjugate a verb. It tells you what is legal and illegal in a sentence. Systemic functional linguistics, on the other hand, looks at language as a tool for building a worldview.
Okay, so it goes deeper than just grammar.
Way deeper. It asks, why did the speaker choose this specific grammatical structure to interact with their social environment? SFL looks at three interlocking levels: the ideational, the interpersonal, and the textual.
Okay, let's take those one by one. Start with the ideational level.
The ideational level is simply about how language represents reality, who is doing what to whom. When linguists analyze Pindar's grammar at this level, they look at the participants, which are the nouns, and the process types, which are the verbs. In Pindar, the dominant participants are always gods, heroes, and the human victors.
But wait, if I'm the athlete who just spent months sweating, bleeding, and training to win the wrestling match, shouldn't I be the one doing the action in the sentence? Like, I won the match.
You would think so, but linguistically, Pindar almost never positions the human victor as the active agent of a material process.
Really?
Really. The gods are always positioned grammatically as the ultimate agents. They're the ones initiating the action, the giving, the granting, the doing. The human victor, despite his immense physical effort, is almost always grammatically positioned as the recipient or the beneficiary.
So, to use an analogy, it's like watching a football game where a wide receiver runs a brilliant 80-yard route, evades 3 tackles, and makes a diving catch in the end zone. But the next day, the newspaper headline doesn't say, receiver scores touchdown. The grammar of the headline insists on saying, the quarterback bestowed a completed pass upon the receiver. The grammar itself steals the agency from the human and gives it to the higher power.
That is exactly how it functions. Pindar's grammar is a linguistic encoding of his deepest theological conviction. Human excellence is entirely derivative of divine generosity. A human being cannot be a sole, autonomous agent of greatness.
That is fascinating. What about the interpersonal level? How does he relate to his audience?
At the interpersonal level, Pindar's voice modulates between claiming divine inspiration directly from the muses and asserting his own professional, learned craft as a master poet. What stands out linguistically is his modality. Modality refers to the degree of certainty in a statement. Pindar's modality is exceptionally high. He does not hedge his bets. He never says, "It might be that the gods favored you," or "Perhaps Zeus smiled upon this race." He states his theological claims with the absolute unbending certainty of a religious prophet.
And finally, the textual level. How does he organize the sentences?
SFL uses a concept called theme-rime structure. The theme is the starting point of the message, usually the very first element in the clause. It signals to the listener what is most important. Pindar consistently places the most prestigious divine element in this theme position: the name of the god, the sacred festival, the ancestral hero. The rime, which is the rest of the sentence, simply elaborates on it. The very order of the words constantly forces the listener's ear and attention back to the divine origin of the event.
So the grammar, the syntax, the choreography of the choir, it is all relentlessly driving home this profound religious seriousness. He's not just a flatterer for hire who sprinkles in some gods for flavor. He truly believes this. And this moral seriousness really comes out in how he handles mythology. The sources give a vivid example from Olympian 1.
Oh, this is a great example.
This was written for Hiero of Syracuse after a major victory. Pindar starts telling the ancient myth of a figure named Pelops, but right in the middle of the poem, he suddenly hits the brakes and basically censors the myth. What is the story there?
This is one of the most famous and, frankly, shocking moments in ancient literature. The traditional received myth, the story everyone in the stands would have known since childhood, was that Pelops' father, Tantalus, invited the gods to a grand banquet. To test their omniscience, Tantalus did the unthinkable. He chopped up his own son, Pelops, boiled his flesh in a cauldron, and served him to the gods as a stew.
It is so incredibly gruesome. It's like a horror movie.
It is horrific. And the myth continues that the goddess Demeter, who was distracted by grief over her own missing daughter, accidentally ate a piece of Pelops' shoulder before the gods realized what they were being served.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The gods then reconstructed and resurrected Pelops, giving him an ivory shoulder to replace the missing flesh.
Okay, so Pindar is performing for the most powerful man in the world, and he comes to this part of the myth. What does he do?
He absolutely refuses to tell it. He interrupts his own vertical narrative in Olympian 1 and directly addresses the audience. He says, "To me, it is impossible to call one of the blessed gods cannibal. I keep aloof."
He literally says, in telling ill tales is often little gain. He's worried about blasphemy.
Yes. Pindar insists that it is fundamentally impious to attribute cannibalism and gluttony to the divine. He cannot stomach the theology of a god eating a human child, so he revises the myth on the spot.
Just makes up a new version.
Exactly. He creates a brand new, sanitized version where Poseidon, the god of the sea, simply falls in love with the young Pelops and carries him away to Mount Olympus, much like Zeus did with Ganymede, the whole boiled in a cauldron story. Pindar says that was just a malicious rumor started by envious, gossiping neighbors who couldn't find the boy.
Now, let's pause here and connect this to our main mission. If you are a Christian listening to this, you might be thinking, okay, interesting ancient trivia, but why should I care that a polytheistic Greek poet censored a myth about cannibal gods? What does this have to do with biblical theology?
It has everything to do with the doctrine of general revelation. Think about what is happening in Pindar's mind. He is operating entirely within the dark, confusing framework of pagan polytheism. He has no Bible, he has no prophets,
Right.
yet he feels an immense, undeniable internal pressure toward moral goodness and religious propriety. He instinctively knows that if there's a divine realm, it must be higher, purer, and better than the worst atrocities of humanity. From a Christian perspective, this is a vivid, undeniably powerful illustration of the imago Dei, the image of God functioning within him.
It is literally the Apostle Paul's argument in Romans 1 and 2 playing out in real time. Paul argues that even those without the written law of Moses have the law written on their hearts. Their consciences bear witness. They have some knowledge of God's invisible attributes revealed through creation.
Exactly. Pindar's moral instinct acts as a general revelation check against degraded human mythology. The fact that he refuses to ascribe cannibalism to the divine order is proof that the human conscience, even when buried under layers of pagan confusion, retains a deep sensitivity to the true, holy character of God. Pindar's moral seriousness is the image of God inside him desperately reaching toward the truth.
That gives me chills. He knows, deep in his bones, that God must be better than the stories his culture tells. But even with that profound moral seriousness, Pindar is plagued by a massive, inescapable anxiety. And this brings us to the core of the human condition and the problem of human frailty. Because underneath all the gold, the roaring crowds, the galloping horses, and the linguistic brilliance, Pindar is deeply haunted.
He is profoundly haunted by death, by transience, and the sheer fragility of human life. He writes these magnificent odes about glory, but the underlying, pulsing anxiety is that all of it is fading away the second he stops singing.
Yeah.
In Pythian 8, he writes what is perhaps his most famous nomai, or philosophical maxim. He asks the ultimate existential question: what is someone? What is no one? Man is a dream of a shadow.
Man is a dream of a shadow. I want you, the listener, to just sit with that phrase for a second. It is chilling, and it is so incredibly relevant to how we live today. Think about it. We build massive corporate empires. We obsess over our 401ks. We curate perfect Instagram feeds. We try to publish books or get our names on buildings. Why? To avoid this exact terrifying reality, we are transient. We are a vapor. We are a shadow, dreaming it has substance. Pindar diagnosed this existential dread 2,500 years before modern psychology.
And he didn't just diagnose the dread, he recognized the greatest danger that arises from it: hybris, or pride. When mortal men try to escape their transience by overreaching, when they try to violently grasp divine permanence for themselves, they invite absolute destruction.
He uses the true story of Tantalus to illustrate this, right? The same Tantalus who was Pelops' dad, the one who didn't actually boil his son in Pindar's revised version. Yeah. What was Tantalus' real sin?
Yes. In Olympian 1, after rejecting the cannibalism myth, Pindar still has to explain why Tantalus was punished by the gods. Tantalus had everything a mortal could dream of. He was a human who was actually invited to feast with the gods at their table. But Pindar says his high fortune he could not digest.
He couldn't digest it. I love that phrasing.
Tantalus got greedy. He stole the nectar and ambrosia, the literal food and drink of immortality from the gods, and smuggled it down to his human friends. He tried to steal divine permanence. He tried to hack his way out of being a shadow.
And the gods do not take kindly to hackers. What is his punishment?
It is perfectly tailored psychological torture. The father of the gods hangs a massive heavy stone directly over Tantalus's head. It is eternally suspended, eternally teetering, eternally about to crush him, but it never falls. Pindar says, he endureth a hopeless life of endless misery.
So it's just endless dread.
Endless dread. The warning Pindar weaves through all his odes is explicit. Seek not to become Zeus. Humans must stay in their lane. That the gods are jealous, they are capricious, and they will absolutely crush human presumption.
So, as a Greek aristocrat listening to this, you are left with a terrifying operating system. You are a fading shadow. But if you try to make yourself immortal, a giant rock will hang over your head forever. That is incredibly bleak. What is Pindar's solution? If we are fading shadows, what do we do?
This is where Pindar's magnificent worldview shows its ultimate tragic inadequacy. His only answer is purely horizontal. He cannot offer resurrection. He cannot offer eternal life. The only way to achieve a tiny, fleeting slice of permanence is through human memory.
A poem?
Exactly. An athletic victory immortalized in the perfect linguistic amber of a Pindaric poem becomes a temporary shelter against the oblivion of death.
Just a temporary flash of light against the encroaching darkness.
That's all he has. Pindar boldly claims poetry alone confers immortal fame. He can only offer the athlete's perishable crown, preserved in his verse, as a consolation prize for mortality. It's a beautiful, heroic attempt to defeat death with art, but it cannot actually solve the underlying problem.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the great collision with biblical theology. Let's pivot to the Old Testament. Because the writers of the Old Testament take this exact diagnosis, the frailty of man, the danger of pride, and they offer a completely different universe. Let's start with the contrasting nature of the divine. If you line up the gods of Pindar next to Yahweh, the God of Israel, what's the fundamental difference?
The contrast is absolute and foundational. As we discussed, Pindar's gods are powerful, elevated, and awe-inspiring, but they are morally ambiguous. Zeus's affairs with mortal women literally produce the heroic bloodlines that underpin Pindar's entire aristocratic system.
Right, their bad behavior is actually baked into the system.
Yes, the gods are driven by erotic passions, they are prone to arbitrary fits of jealousy, and crucially, they are ultimately subject to Moira, or fate. They do not invent the moral order, they're bound by it, and they frequently violate it.
How does the God of the Old Testament shatter that paradigm?
The God of the Old Testament is absolutely holy and morally unconditioned. He is the infinite source of the moral law, not a subject trapped within it. where Pindar's Zeus presides over the Olympic Games, which is fundamentally a contest of comparing human worth, determining who is stronger and richer. The God of Israel declares that all human comparisons are utterly inadequate apart from divine grace.
Yeah, totally different standard.
As the prophet Isaiah says in chapter 64, all our righteous deeds, our greatest victories, our finest Pindaric odes are like a polluted garment before absolute holiness.
I want to dig into how the Old Testament handles Pindar's obsession with aristocratic privilege. If Pindar believes your ultimate worth comes from your noble bloodline and that excellence is strictly inherited, how do the Hebrew Scriptures react to that specific idea?
The Old Testament radically, relentlessly levels the playing field. It is a point-by-point dismantling of the idea that bloodline equals worth. First, Genesis 1 establishes that every single human being is created in the imago Dei.
Human dignity isn't restricted to the wealthy winners of a chariot race. It is universally shared by the king and the servant alike.
Exactly. Furthermore, Deuteronomy 10 explicitly states that God shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. You cannot buy his favor with a golden tripod at Delphi.
The prophets really lean into this, don't they? They go after the ancient elite with a sledgehammer.
They absolutely do. The prophetic tradition constantly attacks the presumption that noble birth or massive wealth equals divine favor. Read the prophet Amos delivering devastating judgment oracles against the wealthy, comfortable, aristocratic houses of Israel who lounge on ivory beds while ignoring the poor. Or read Isaiah warning the proud, wealthy daughters of Zion.
So in the biblical worldview, true worth is about heart obedience to a holy God, not pedigree. God doesn't care if your great-grandfather was Hercules or if your family owns the fastest horses in Syracuse.
Exactly. Pindar's entire life's work of celebrating hereditary distinction is dismantled by the Old Testament's radical leveling of all humans before the Creator.
But here's what I find so compelling. While the Old Testament rejects Pindar's aristocratic solution, it actually completely agrees with his underlying diagnosis of human frailty, doesn't it? I mean, when Pindar says, man is a dream of a shadow, that sounds like he is quoting the book of Ecclesiastes.
It really does. The theme of transience is a profound point of resonance between the two worlds. The biblical wisdom literature explores this frailty with even greater, more devastating honesty than Pindar. The psalmist writes in Psalm 103, "As for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field, for the wind passes over it, and it is gone, and its place knows it no more."
Or think of Koheleth, the author of Ecclesiastes, crying out, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." The Hebrew word there is hebel, which literally means vapor or a breath on a cold morning. You see it for a second, and then it vanishes.
Yes. And what is so striking is that Ecclesiastes explicitly indicts the very pursuit of fame through great works that Pindar champions. Koheleth says, "I made great works, I built houses, I gathered silver and gold, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind."
The writer of Ecclesiastes essentially had the ancient equivalent of 20 Olympic gold medals, unimaginable wealth, the ultimate royal pedigree, and he still looked at it all and said, it's a shadow.
Precisely. And Psalm 49 directly confronts the temptation to trust in inherited wealth and status, the very things Pindar praised. The psalmist writes, "Those who trust in their wealth. Truly, no man can ransom another or give to God the price of his life. Man in his pomp will not remain. He is like the beasts that perish."
Wow.
Psalm 49 makes the exact theological argument that Pindar's aristocratic world desperately tries to deny. Noble blood and athletic fame do not exempt anyone from the grave.
But the biblical solution to this dread is entirely different. Pindar writes a poem. What does the Old Testament offer?
Let's look at Isaiah 40, which is perhaps the Old Testament's most sustained meditation on human transience. The prophet says, "The grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows on it. Surely the people are grass." That is Pindar's diagnosis exactly. But then comes the breathtaking vertical solution. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever.
Wow. So the absolute permanence that Pindar is desperately trying to synthesize through human poetry. Isaiah says that true permanence belongs to divine revelation alone. No victory ode, no matter how brilliantly composed, can give you what only God's eternal word possesses.
Exactly. The Old Testament agrees with the grim diagnosis of the disease, but points to a completely different, transcendent cure.
Okay, this is blowing my mind. We've moved from the chariots of Syracuse to the prophets of Israel. But here is where the narrative flips completely upside down. The New Testament doesn't just critique Pindar's world. The Apostle Paul takes the exact vocabulary Pindar uses to praise aristocrats and turns it inside out to praise a crucified carpenter. Let's start with the Greek word doxa, which translates to glory.
In the world of Pindar's Odes, doxa is everything. It is the ultimate goal of human existence. It is visible splendor, immense reputation, massive wealth, athletic triumph. It is, as Pindar describes in Olympian 1, the gold shining like fire in the night. It is the visible, undeniable evidence of greatness honored by both men and gods.
But then Paul gets hold of the word
And
doxa.
Paul radically, scandalously redefines it. In 2 Corinthians 4, Paul talks about the ultimate glory of God. But where does this glory shine? Does it shine in the face of a victorious aristocratic athlete wearing a crown? No.
No.
It shines in the face of Jesus Christ, a man who, by worldly Pindaric standards, was poor, entirely uncredentialed, rejected by the elite, and executed as a state criminal in the most humiliating way possible. Paul says, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ."
That is amazing.
The divine light imagery that Pindar uses exclusively for noble human excellence is claimed by Paul as the exclusive property of the crucified Christ.
It's an absolute subversion of their entire value system.
Yeah.
And Paul goes even further when he talks about election, who God actually chooses to lavish his favor on. Pindar's theology insists that God chooses the strong, the noble-born, the beautiful. What does Paul say to the church in Corinth?
In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul addresses the aristocratic pretensions of his audience head-on. He says, "Consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth."
Wait, he's literally listing the exact 3 requirements for a Pindaric ode: wisdom, power, and noble birth.
He is outlining the Greek ideal of arena turret, and then Paul delivers the death blow to that worldview. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are.
That is a point-by-point annihilation of Pindar's theology. God deliberately bypassed the heroic bloodlines, the descendants of Hercules, the billionaires of Syracuse, to favor the nobodies, the weak, the despised, the people with 0 societal credentials.
It is the ultimate cosmic inversion. And to drive the point home to the Corinthians, who, remember, live right near the site of the Isthmian Games, one of the 4 great Panhellenic festivals, Paul actually adopts Pindar's athletic metaphors to make his case.
Yes. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul writes, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize?"
Paul uses the exact language of the games, the brutal race, the strict physical discipline, the self-control. But he does this to execute a brilliant rhetorical pivot. He writes, "Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable."
The perishable wreath.
Yeah.
The Stephanos Thartos, that is the wild olive branch of Olympia, the parsley of Nemea. That is the very object. Pindar spends 45 intricate, brilliant odes glorifying as the absolute highest mortal achievement.
And Paul casually dismisses it as perishable. He acknowledges the immense, grueling discipline the athletes put in, but he redirects that imagery to an infinitely more important, eternal contest. The Christian is running for an imperishable crown, apkartos.
Oh, that's so good.
True imperishable life comes through the resurrection of Christ, not through athletic distinction. Pindar can only offer a beautiful song as a temporary shelter against death. The New Testament boldly declares that death itself has been conquered.
I want to bring back the linguistic analysis here because the source document applies Constantine Campbell's verbal aspect framework to Paul's writing in Philippians 3, and honestly, this might be the most beautiful part of the whole deep dive. In Philippians 3, Paul is listing his own religious and cultural credentials. He says he was circumcised on the 8th day, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee.
By ancient Jewish standards, those are elite, untouchable credentials. If Paul were a Greek athlete, that resume would make a phenomenal Pindar ode. He had the pure bloodline, the immense zeal, the flawless religious pedigree.
But Paul looks at that glorious resume and calls it all rubbish. The Greek word is skubala, which is much stronger than rubbish. It means dung or refuse.
Yes, and this is where Campbell's linguistic framework reveals the depth of what Paul is doing. When we apply verbal aspect theory, we look at how the grammatical construction of verbs views the action. When Paul talks about his past aristocratic and religious credentials, the things he used to boast in, he uses aorist perfective verbs.
Okay, we need another ELI 5 analogy here. What does perfective aspect mean for the listener?
Think of perfective aspect like watching a movie on your television screen. You are sitting on your couch, looking at the entire screen from the outside. The events on the screen are complete, they are distant, they are closed off from you. I was circumcised, I was a Pharisee. It's in the rearview mirror. It is a closed, dead event.
Okay, I follow that.
But when Paul pivots to talk about his pursuit of Christ, his desperate desire to know him and the power of his resurrection, he switches his grammar entirely. He begins using present tense imperfective verbs. I press on. I do not consider myself to have made it my own. I strain forward.
And how is the imperfective aspect different?
If the perfective aspect is watching the movie on a screen, the imperfective aspect is putting on a VR headset and being inside the movie as it is happening. You are viewing the action from the inside. It is unfolding, ongoing, immediate, and all-consuming.
Oh, that is brilliant. So the grammar itself tells the story of his conversion. His past human achievements, his pedigree, his worldly glories, they're dead, closed off, perfective.
Yeah.
But the pursuit of Christ is an immediate, living, ongoing reality.
Yes, beautifully said.
It literally reverses Pindar's characteristic movement. We talked about Pindar's vertical narrative, where he always moves backward, looking up to the past, seeking glory in ancient ancestral myths. But Paul moves aggressively forward, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead.
Exactly. The very tense of the Greek verbs preaches the gospel. Paul's grammar embodies his theology.
That is just incredible. So let's talk about how the church historically handled this collision of worldviews, because you have early Christians living in a Greco-Roman world saturated with Pindar's poetry and this obsession with worldly glory. Did the early church fathers just look at Pindar, see all the polytheism, the cannibal myths, and the aristocratic pride, and just throw his books in the fire?
Not at all. And this is a profoundly instructive lesson for how Christians can faithfully engage with secular culture today. Writers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, brilliant men like Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria, did not burn Pindar's books. They read Greek literature as a preparatio evangelica, a preparation for the gospel.
A preparation? How could a poem praising Zeus prepare someone for Jesus?
Because they found in Pindar's deep moral seriousness, his stark warnings against human pride, and his profound aching sense of human frailty, intimations of truths that Scripture reveals fully. Clement of Alexandria actually quoted Pindar approvingly in his writings. He did. He argued that the Greek poets, through reason and the conscience, the image of God we discussed earlier, had partial access to divine wisdom. They diagnosed the human condition correctly, but they desperately needed the revelation of Christ to arrive at the fullness of the cure.
I know Origen, another great early theologian, was deeply educated in the Greek literary tradition as well. He took Pindar's themes of the soul's journey and developed them in a fully Christian direction. But the big gun here is Augustine. How did Augustine of Hippo deal with this cultural obsession with glory?
Augustine provides the most systematic, devastating theological response to the world Pindar represents. In his massive masterwork, The City of God, Augustine takes on the entire classical Roman and Greek tradition of Gloria, the relentless pursuit of earthly fame, military glory, and athletic celebrity.
Right.
Augustine argues that the earthly city's pursuit of glory is fundamentally a disordered love. It tragically substitutes human reputation and the praise of dying men for the supreme love of God.
It's the ultimate misdirection of worship. You are worshiping the shadow instead of the light.
Precisely. And Augustine contrasts this dark, frantic, earthly city with the city of God. The city of God is built entirely on divine grace, not inherited or preate. It is characterized by deep humility, and it demands the absolute renunciation of competitive pride. It is the exact, deliberate, point-by-point opposite of the Pindaric value system.
John Chrysostom did this too, didn't he?
He did. The great preacher did the exact same thing in his sermons, constantly drawing on Paul to commend the humility of the cross as the only genuine crown, directly attacking the competitive vanity of the ancient audiences listening to him.
So bringing this all home to the present moment, if you are a Christian listening to this right now, maybe you're driving to work, maybe you're doing the dishes, maybe you're sitting at a desk feeling the pressure to build your own legacy, how does reading a polytheistic poet who wrote about chariot races 2,500 years ago actually deepen your faith today? The sources outline 3 really profound practical benefits. Let's unpack them organically. What is the first major takeaway?
The first is a deep capacity for empathy and understanding. Pindar captures, with truly unsurpassed linguistic beauty, the universal human condition apart from grace. He articulates the profound, aching, desperate human need to matter, to be remembered, to participate in something permanent before we die.
The terrifying fear of being just a dream of a shadow.
Exactly. Understanding this helps Christians empathize deeply with the secular culture around them. When you see your neighbor obsessing over their career trajectory, sacrificing their family for their legacy, or obsessing over their status symbols, you shouldn't just judge them.
Right, because we understand where it comes from.
You should recognize the exact same desperate longing that drove Hiero of Syracuse to hire Pindar. It's the human heart crying out for eternity, but looking for it in perishable wreaths.
That is so true. It changes your posture from judgment to compassion. And what is the second benefit of studying this?
It radically deepens your appreciation for the magnitude of the gospel's answer. When the Apostle Paul writes that the pursuit of human glory is rubbish compared to the surpassing worth of knowing Christ, modern readers often just nod along because it sounds nice.
Yeah, it's easy to say.
But when you immerse yourself in Pindar, when you realize just how incredibly magnificent, intoxicating, and culturally dominant earthly glory appeared to the ancient world, when you see the gold and the galloping horses and the unparalleled poetry, you understand just how unimaginably radical it was for Paul to look at all of that and call it garbage.
Wow.
Pindar is the most eloquent, brilliant advocate for the very world system that the cross dismantles. Seeing the overwhelming strength of the illusion makes the truth of the gospel shine that much brighter.
Oh, Hattie, it's hard. It's easy to reject the world when you only look at its ugly side. It's much, much harder to reject it when it looks like a magnificent Pindar ode. It really magnifies the power of Christ to outshine that kind of beauty. And that actually leads perfectly to the third benefit, right?
It does. The third benefit is the reminder that all true beauty is ultimately a reflection of God. Pindar's dense literary artistry, his absolute mastery of meter and imagery, his conviction that crafting beautiful language is a necessary way of honoring the divine words. These are actual models for Christians.
Because God cares about beauty, too.
Yes, it reminds us that the God of truth is also the God of order, symmetry, and beauty. The immense care with which Pindar calibrates his praise reflects a seriousness about language that resonates with the Christian conviction that the Word of God should never be handled carelessly or cheaply. We can and should appreciate traces of the image of God in a brilliant man who simply lacked the special revelation to give his brilliance its proper eternal object.
So we don't have to burn the books. We can affirm the beauty, we can clearly discern and critique the inadequate, perishable solution he offers, and we can use the entire encounter to deepen our overwhelming gratitude for the imperishable crown we have been given in Christ.
Precisely. We take what is true and beautiful, we subject it rigorously to the canon of Scripture, and we walk away with a much deeper, more robust understanding of both the disease of human pride and the miraculous cure of the gospel.
What an incredible, sweeping journey today. We started with the dust and chariots of Syracuse and the glittering, exclusionary, aristocratic world of ancient Greece. We stared into the chilling, existential realization that man is a dream of a shadow. We saw the Old Testament completely level human pride and aristocratic presumption, proving that God shows no partiality to bloodlines or bank accounts. And finally, we witnessed the Apostle Paul completely invert the ancient concept of glory, taking the perishable, fading wreath of the athlete and replacing it with the imperishable, eternal crown of the crucified and risen Christ.
And if we connect all of this to the biggest picture possible, it leaves us with one final, profound reflection for you to dwell on today.
Let's hear it.
Think about Pindar's life. He dedicated his entire existence, his immense once-in-a-generation genius, and his unbelievably beautiful words to trying to grant mortal men a tiny, fleeting slice of immortality through human poetry. He tried to build a magnificent ladder of words to pull frail humanity up into the divine permanence.
But the biblical narrative gives us the exact, breathtaking opposite.
Yes. In the gospel, the divine words stepped down. He did not ask us to build a ladder. Christ descended into our human transience, taking the full crushing weight of our shadow upon himself on the cross. The ultimate answer to human frailty, to the desperate fear of being forgotten by the universe, isn't a beautiful victory song sung for a wealthy king.
No.
The answer is an empty tomb.
And suddenly, that desperate longing for permanence that Pindar diagnosed 2,500 years ago finds its only true rest. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the ancient world, and may it inspire you to live more fully for the imperishable crown today.